Want to learn everything about how to succeed in e-commerce? Well, you should listen to this brand new podcast from Essential Digital Commerce called Mastering Retail. I am Emma Irwin, and normally I'm helping brands sell stuff on Amazon in my regular job at Flywheel Digital, but now I also have this podcast. You'll join me on a unique journey to mastering e-commerce through the perspective of both retail and media topics. Think paid search, content, supply chain, sales, data, and so much more, which is where the word retail comes from. I promise to bring you knowledge from the brightest minds we have within our company.
I will screw it up. You just give me time.
Which you won't want to miss. So join us for the ride to Mastering Retail.
The Black Fantastic is a territory within which Black artists are articulating and offering their own fictions about Black presence and are trying to look beyond some of the ways that Black people have historically been confined or constrained as a way of saying that we can't or won't be defined by a Western imaginary. We will articulate for ourselves with all the passion and purpose that we might bring to that topic. We will articulate for ourselves our own ways of being and seeing and walking through the world.
That's the British writer, curator, and broadcaster Ekow Eshun talking about his new exhibition in the Black Fantastic, now showing at London's Hayward Gallery. You're listening to WGSN Create Tomorrow podcast. I'm Samuel Boakye, Business Development Manager at WGSN, and your co-host on today's episode with my colleague Mel Larsen, Strategist on WGSN Insight. Ekow is chairman of the Fourth Plinth Commissioning Group, overseeing the most prestigious public art program in the UK, and the former director of the ICA London. He is the author of critically lauded books Black Gold of the Sun, Africa's State of Mind, and most recently, in the Black Fantastic. At WGSN, part of our STEPIC methodology that we use in our trend forecasting includes looking at culture and creativity. And so in that vein, we invited Ekow on the show to talk about the exhibition and accompanying book. We spoke more widely about themes of the Black Fantastic versus Afrofuturism, the power of speculative film and fiction, the relevance of artists from Chris Ofili to Beyonce in expressing a Black experience, and concept of double consciousness. So let's hear what the exhibition is all about.
It's really the idea, kind of proposition around how artists of African origin, Black artists in the US, the UK, and internationally are drawing from myth and speculative fiction, from African cultural practices and even spiritual beliefs, from legend, from folklore, from the past and also into the future. Drawing from myth and drawing from speculative fictions as a way to interrogate ideas of the racialized everyday. And I suppose what I mean by that is that certainly in terms of the exhibition at the Hayward, it's a group show with 11 different artists, but each of those artists, I think, begins their work from an awareness and an understanding that the idea of race itself is a fiction, it's a social construct, it's something that has no basis in scientific fact, but is nevertheless something which holds a defining sway over how we all see the world. The Black Fantastic is a territory within which Black artists are articulating and offering their own fictions about Black presence and are trying to look beyond some of the ways that Black people have historically been confined or constrained by a Western imagination that characterizes us sometimes as other, as alien, as underdeveloped, as primitive in some ways. These artists are offering their own fictions and their own ways of constructing and imagining Blackness, not as something limited, but as something unlimited, as a space for new imagining, as a space for possibility, as a space for new dreams that bring to life our interiors, our hopes, our dreams, our reaching towards out of ourselves, towards the cosmos. There's a way of saying that we can't or won't be defined by a Western imaginary. We will articulate for ourselves with all the passion and purpose that we might bring to that topic. We will articulate for ourselves our own ways of being and seeing and walking through the world.
How does the Black Fantastic differentiate from Afrofuturism?
Afrofuturism is a term that's coined in the 1990s, really is I think it in quite brilliant ways in its time to as a first proposition that links African existence with futurist propositions. We can think about the work of someone like Sun Ra, kind of jazz musician who famously defined himself as someone who'd been abducted from Earth in his childhood and raised on the planet Venus, and then returned to Earth to show Black people a way into the future and out into the stars. These are kind of brilliant metaphors and brilliant propositions. My feeling was that Afrofuturism as a term, unfortunately, that's so familiar, at least to a lot of people, that it lends itself to cliche. So we think of Sun Ra, but we also then think of pyramids and flying saucers and some of those kind of stock images. And it also felt to me that we're in a time right now, I don't know what you two think, but I think we're in a time right now where, as well as Black artists, Black musicians, Black filmmakers, Black writers are thinking speculatively in terms that run much broader than a term like Afrofuturism can really encompass. So look, if you look at something like Lemonade, Beyonce's Lemonade, visual album, kind of great, beguiling, intriguing work. But actually, what Beyonce is really exploring, in part anyway, folklores and Black costumes that reach back to Africa, but also reach back into African American past in the 19th century. She makes direct reference to a film called Daughters of the Dust by a filmmaker called Julie Dash. She is thinking about African fables. There's a kind of significant African fable called The Legend of the Flying Africans. I won't go into it, but it dates back from the early 19th century. Beyonce is doing all of these things which have little really to do with the future, but nevertheless, are to do with thinking about how tapping into belief, cultural practice, folklore allows us to broaden the spectrum of how we understand ourselves and our place in the Western world and our place in the world generally. So this seems to me a broader, richer territory than just Afrofuturism. That forms part of the Black Fantastic. But this turn towards the fantastic as a territory which Black people now are choosing to own and inhabit and explore and populate. I think it's something I wanted to mark, and I wanted to mark it outside some of the ways that these imaginings have been described before in terms of a phrase like Afrofuturism.
I'm hearing you describe the distinction between Afrofuturism and the Black Fantastic. It almost feels like the Black Fantastic can be more parallel in a sense, right, to everything that happened and everything that is going on. Unlike Afrofuturism, where going back to the flying saucers, the alien abduction, things of that nature, it's a lot more future fantasy. Like it kind of reminds me, it was Gallagher, I believe. You had a piece of Hayward with it was a piece that represented how African women were thrown over the boats, but their infants turned into UFOs. So I mean, obviously that's a real thing that happened during history, but that concept within itself is parallel. So I just want to call that out. And my question is, what prompted you to write and curate the Black Fantastic in the first place?
Well, I think that it's a good question, Sam. I just think we're in a really fascinating time right now. For most of I was working on those projects mostly over the last couple of years, and the last couple of years have been strange times for all of us. Pandemic, COVID, but also George Floyd, also Black Lives Matter. It's a time of existential anxieties in all sorts of ways. And one of the things I've been really aware of, and one of the things that personally, and I don't know about you, but has got me through this time, is looking at and listening to and reading work that takes me into myself, but also takes me out of myself. And I've been really aware of how so many different Black cultural creative figures have drawn on these territories of rich imagining. So I talk about, talk about Beyonce, but you can also look at Solange. The seat at the table is just, for me, it's like such an amazing, powerful record because it's about this state of dreaming that Solange conjures in the record. So I place that absolutely in the realm of the Black Fantastic. This is about how one of the things that happened during COVID, certainly in America in the first year anyway of the pandemic, was that African Americans disproportionately affected. disproportionately infected by the virus, disproportionately dead, killed by the virus, and all sorts of different reasons for that. But one of the ways through that I was so aware of, one of the ways that I got through was to think about artists who are capable of thinking about both life in its fullness and capaciousness, but also death, also the sadness and the horror, really, of death as a present condition, either through something like COVID or through the ways in American terms anyway. There's something like 250 people, black people, killed every year in America by police, by white vigilantes, as a consequence of not being allowed, quote unquote, to belong in society. Someone decides that they don't have a legitimate place in society. Someone decides that they must be removed from society. And that's just, think about George Floyd and so on. It's almost unthinkable. What I gain from is looking at art or listening to music that can address those really difficult histories and really difficult present days, and then take us further, take us higher, take us deeper. That's how I got through some of this. And I wanted to share some of that because I think one of the aspects that so much work shares is this delving into past, is this conjuring of speculative and possible futures, is this embrace of myth. And none of that seems to me to be about escape. All of it seems to be about an embracing who we are and who we can be, and a desire to say, let's exercise our imagination as a way to survive and as a way to thrive.
So when would you say you first discovered this kind of work? Were you aware of it growing up? I know that you're a Ghanaian background, so how was that influencing your upbringing?
One of the things that I think people of colour share is this thing of living with more than one heritage at the same time. If you're me, it's a Ghanaian background, which meant that I'm growing up at home. My parents immigrated to the UK from Ghana. So part of our upbringing is entirely Ghanaian. It's the language they speak at home, it's the food they eat, but then you walk outside the house and you have a Western London perspective. This is kind of duality. This is a kind of commonplace. Children of immigrants, this is one of the things we grow up with. There's a significant African American philosopher, really, of race in the early 20th century called W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois had a concept called double consciousness, which this really breaks down to, as a person of colour, being obliged to see the world twice over. Du Bois talks about how black people see the world through their eyes and then see the world through the eyes of white people, of mainstream society. Often he talks about that as a jarring condition because you see how black people are then looked at with some elements of contempt by mainstream society or regarded as inferior. So Du Bois talks about double consciousness, but really that thing of double vision, that thing of seeing the world twice over, this is our heritage. This is our inheritance. And Du Bois thinks about that slightly obliquely. I tend to think about that. Something of a superpower, in a way, because it means we walk through the world seeing things with a kind of nuance and a complexity that maybe if you don't have that dual heritage, if you don't have that outsiderness, you don't quite get. And I think so much of Black cultural production begins from this ability to see the layers of the world. And actually, in fact, if you get a chance to see the exhibition, what you'll see is so many of the works actually have an element of collage to them. They're about kind of bringing together different references, sometimes in a picture, sometimes in a sculpture. But in fact, if you think about it, so much Black cultural production is about collaging. Think about hip hop, this melding of sounds and style, moments that gather together. And I tend to think that much of what we culturally, like I say, that we culturally produce is to do with this perspective that we have, in which we can hold the present, but think about our cultural heritages, or even think about the long past within which Black people arrived in the West through forced transportation, through slavery, or through colonialism, or through imperialism. And I think I talk about Black fantastic not as a movement or a genre, but as a way of seeing. And I think at the heart of that way of seeing is this ability to hold more than one perspective at the same time. And I think it's a really powerful attribute that so many of us grow up with, and it tends to lead to extraordinary work.
I definitely resonate with that myself.
Yes, coming from that in-between space when you talked about duality. As soon as you're at home, the language, the culture, the food, it's one world. But as soon as you step out your house or your apartment, you're in a whole different world. So literally living in that in-between is something that I've experienced growing up.
It's an in-between, and it's a both. That's the thing. Because it's not like you are not you, or you become a different you from one state to another. You carry yourself from one state into another state and back. You go between worlds. You're used to that. But the condition of that means that we carry, I think, a number of worlds, a number of ways of seeing in our heads and in our hearts the whole time.
You're listening to the WGSN Create Tomorrow podcast, and we're talking with British curator, writer, and broadcaster Ekow Eshun about his new exhibition, In the Black Fantastic. I asked him how he selected the artist for the show.
There's a bunch of artists that I knew I wanted in the show. Someone like Nick Cave, who's a Chicago-based artist who, I don't know if he's ever had a show in London. He's pretty big in the US. He's never really shown much in the UK at all. So I wanted Nick Cave in the show because he's a spectacular artist. I wanted some British artists in the show, someone like Hugh Locke, who's also got a big show at Take Britain right now. I wanted someone like Wangechi Mutu, who's a Kenyan artist who's based in the US. So there's some artists that I knew I wanted. And there's some artists that I discovered through the process of putting together the show. Someone like Cedric Chisholm, who's a New York-based artist, who, again, he's fairly young, hasn't had much international exposure, but he's a painter and I really loved his paintings and I wanted those also in the show. So the real answer to your question, Sam, comes in, I spent the last couple of years writing these enormous, huge, long lists of artists that I was thinking about, artists that I think spoke to the proposition, and then thinking about, well, where do they belong? And, do they fit within this? And could they be in the show? Or are they an artist that can feature in the book? It's been fun.
I actually want to call out a certain piece. Like, I was trying to wrap my head around it. But Chris Ofili's The Annunciation, I guess my question is like, why that piece? It's very intense. It's very intense. But I wanted to kind of get your point of view as to like why that piece.
So we should describe it as well, because this is a bronze sculpture that the artist Chris Ofili has done. It shows the moment of the Annunciation in the Bible, during which the angel Gabriel comes down to earth and visits the Virgin Mary, and from which is begat Jesus. So look, Chris Ofili, the artist, but Chris's sculpture is not a kind of, well, I don't know if there's a literal representation of that. It's a reimagining of that, in which we have this winged angel figure embracing this very sensual depiction of a woman. She's in this kind of gleaming golden bronze. He's in this very darkened patina. It's a work that is very secular, despite the fact it's kind of describing a spiritual moment. It's very sensual, even erotic. It's, as you say, Sam, it's an intense piece. So, look, the point here is Chris Ofili as an artist has got a long history, in fact, of interpreting and thinking about moments from the Bible, as well as moments from other sources of story and myth. So we pair that sculpture with a number of paintings of his, which draw from scenes from Homer's Odyssey. He's interested in foundational Western stories. Interestingly, those two sets of work, his illustrations from the Odyssey and the Annunciation, have never been shown together. I chose to show them together because I wanted to illustrate part of his process and part of his thinking about drawing from foundational Western myth as a route into creating his own myths and his own ways of seeing and his own imagining. We don't have to regard that sculpture as a sort of literal version of the Bible come true. He's not trying to do that. He's trying to suggest that as an artist, he has agency to expand his own imaginative reach, to expand his own imaginative brief. And as an artist of color, as a Black person, he also has a right and an agency to draw from these myths, to draw from these ideas that exist within the Western imaginary. This is about him inserting himself into history and then saying, from that basis, where do we go? From that basis, in fact, it's not about him necessarily conforming to a set of thinking. It's about him saying, there is yet more to write, to be written. There is yet more to be imagined here.
I'm Sam Boakye. You're listening to the WGSN Create Tomorrow podcast, and we're talking with British curator and writer Ekow Eshun about the Black Fantastic. Ekow differentiates this from Afrofuturism and explains why the latter has its limitations compared to the infinitely boundless Black Fantastic.
So one of the things being pointed out by a number of African writers is that, hold on, this idea of Afrofuturism, in a way, it continues to confine certainly Africa to a sort of weird, historic, underdeveloped past. Because if you take the concept of Afrofuturism, it suggests that there's a linear progression that might take place from Africa, essentially, to America into the future, and that this is a trajectory that people of the diaspora are involved in. That's all fine, unless you happen to be in Africa, in which case the whole thing sounds a bit like you're still working with this idea that Africa is some sort of font of underdevelopment. It's still this perpetually primitive place. So there are actually a number of significant African authors and cultural figures who've taken issue with the concept of Afrofuturism and pointed out that it's quite reductive, it's potentially quite reductive when you look at it beyond an African American perspective, or beyond an African American perspective. And so it's yet another reason why I wanted to look at that, not because I'm sort of against Afrofuturism or anything, but because what's interesting is that you can see the strains that concept is under, because there are more people participating in a cultural conversation from different parts of the world than there were when it was first coined as a term. And I think all the more reason, therefore, why I'm keen when we think about African articulations of possibility or speculation, not to per se confine ourselves to that, but to think more broadly about just how we describe what's going on and how much extraordinary work is going on across the culture.
We're in a time now where spirituality is gaining momentum. Obviously, coming out of the pandemic, people are turning from more structured religions to being spiritual. And I really love the chapter in your book about Black feminist voodoo aesthetic. And I would really like you to elaborate a bit more on that. And also the concept of conjure feminism, which I really was fascinated about.
Oh God, yeah, that's not even my specialist subject. So there's an essay in the book by an academic called Camilla Martin, who is the real expert on this territory. Camilla Martin genuinely wrote a book about lemonade, but she edited a book with a number of academic essays about Beyonce's Lemonade, Lemonade Reader, which I can heartily recommend, because within that and within her own work, she talks about conjure feminism, which is to do with feminism that's rooted in Black spiritual traditions, Black cultural pasts, and uses those as a basis from which to think about womanhood, selfhood, and the power of female presence in the world, and crucially refuses the distinction that's historically made about some of those beliefs, that they are somehow aspects of a superstition, that these are kind of marginal beliefs, that they don't belong within modern or civilized society and so on, that these are voodoo or these are witchcraft, or all these things. Camilla Martin recognizes these as powerful principles of feminist positioning, principles that center female experience, Black female experience, as belief and as lived experience as a foundational way to Black presence in the world. I'm really excited by that as a proposition because it gives validity to female experience, to histories and long and generational histories of Black female presence in ways that certainly kind of mainstream feminist discourses are entirely overlooked. And again, reading or looking at something like, or listening to something like Lemonade is impossible without, well, I mean, you can, but you get more out of listening to something like Lemonade by engaging in some of that territory, by engaging in some of that thinking. You get more out of a seat at the table. You get more out of Black is King by engaging that territory because I think, let's say, Wasan Shire, who's quoted in Lemonade to British East African poet, her work addresses some of this similar territory, and so many other creative and cultural figures, I think, are drawing on some of this same terrain as a form of inspiration, as a form of affirmation, as a form of rejuvenation, even as a riposte and a defense and as a reply to the ways that Black people and Black women are othered and made marginal.
It's the WGSN Create Tomorrow podcast, and we've stepped into the Black Fantastic with writer and curator Ekow Eshun. I asked him about his childhood love of superheroes, and was this the beginning of his love affair with speculative fiction? I read in an interview by The Guardian that growing up you wanted to be Spider-Man. Why that particular hero?
Because who wouldn't want to be Spider-Man? You get to walk on walls and spring building to building. This seems to me a great thing. I grew up reading a lot of comics. That was back in the days when they existed as physical things. Grew up reading a lot of superhero comics. This was my first introduction to speculative fiction. It's my first introduction to thinking about the body beyond the ordinary. It's my first introduction to thinking that you could imagine yourself other, and that being other was not a condition necessarily of exile, but was a route into further possibility, that you could shape and refashion your own sense of self and your own presence in the world. I'm not sure I'd used those words at the time when I was reading Spider-Man, but with hindsight, I can see that's some of what I saw in those comics. But I think look, I'm not alone in this, but one of the fascinating exams feels like the world's caught up. So, what are our most popular movies right now? I think actually Spider-Man pretty much was the highest grossing movie this year, with whichever the third Spider-Man movie is. So those kind of conversations that I was having in my own head back then when I was a kid, in a way, those form part of popular culture, popular entertainment, so much more broadly right now in terms of Marvel movies. So right now I watch, what were we watching yesterday? Basically every Marvel series that comes on, I watch it with my kids. We were watching Ms. Marvel yesterday. We're going to go and see Thor on the weekend. Those things have their limitations in all sorts of ways, but I'm all for this way of reading the world that's intolerant with ordinariness. I'm sort of deeply suspicious of an idea of the world that presents what we see as all there is. And by that, I'm not sort of per se just kind of conjuring other states for the sake of it. Look, I will say this, that if you're a person of color, one of your experiences of the world, again, comes down to this thing of double vision. One of your experiences of the world is that people can look at you in surprised and alarming and disturbing ways, that the route down the street that you take is not necessarily an easy route. You can walk down the street and be, othered in all sorts of ways. Basically, the Black experience is kind of odd. It's kind of strange. It's sometimes disturbing and disquieting. It's also sometimes extraordinary. So one of the places that observation takes me to is that I try not to take for granted just that what is. In fact, what is quite strange quite a lot of the time. So I'm all for comics and movies that remind us that we can wake up in the morning and find that what we thought was the case may not be the case so much anymore. We can wake up in the morning perhaps and find we have superpowers, or find that we're entered another dimension. This is just a reminder that the ordinary world itself is already strange. We're already living in the midst of these odd fantasies like the idea of race. We're already living in this consensual set of fantasies that has all sorts of implications for who we are and how we live. We can be reminded of that, and that then can lead us to thinking about how we own our own presence in the world. So, yes, I wanted to be Spider-Man. Part of me still does.
I wanted to be the Black Ranger from Power Rangers growing up.
Let's bring it out.
Yeah, I myself was heavily into Marvel comics for a time period when I was young. I feel like when you describe the Black experience, the first thing that came up to my mind was like living in the X-Men, right? Like just literally walking down that different, but at the same time, we do hone these superpowers, right? I personally feel that way. This is Sam Boakye here. Ekow Eshun looks back to his childhood roots in the Black Fantastic.
There are actually one or two images date back to my childhood. There was a great Ghanaian funk band from the 70s called Osibisa.
Yeah,
Wow. That's crazy. Album covers, they were like flying elephants on the cover.
Yeah.
I remember this is what we had lying around. If there's a link, it lies with things like that, where you make this connection, say, yeah, I'm reading X-Men comics, but we also got Osibisa on the stereo, we've got Fela Kuti on the stereo. It's figures that Fela cast himself as a Superman in his own way anyway. Osibisa, they're like describing these fantastical flying elephants, all sorts of things. You realize, okay, look, yeah, they're telling stories about who we are. That's kind of what's going on in there. And yeah, okay, this is one of the places where it starts. And I haven't really stopped. And actually, it's only just talking to you right now, I realized that one of the reasons those Osibisa records are in this book is because I remember them from back then, from being a child. I'd never forgotten them because I went from reading comics to reading science fiction books to thinking about, and ultimately then to some of the dense cultural theory books that I really like, which yet again take us back to Blackness as a dimensional experience. I was having a long conversation with one of the artists in the show the other day about Blackness and its parallels to quantum physics and quantum theory, because quantum theory talks about an existence of simultaneity. Quantum theory is about a collapsing of time and a collapsing of space into a kind of a layered, stacked version of space rather than a linear space. And again, I think about this in relation to the ways we've been talking about Blackness as a hybrid, collaged, métier way of seeing the world. So all of these things they all end up coming back around.
So Ekow, rewinding a little bit, can you tell us a bit about how the Black cultural theorist Stuart Hall, his work really helped shape your experience as a Black British man?
Well, yeah. So here's the thing. I feel like we've all got our own origin stories. We've all got our own ways that we came into this world. Mine starts with comics and starts with this kind of embrace of superheroics. When I was about 17 or something, I remember going to Brent Town Hall Library in London. It was my closest library. And I came across this publication, which was this, it was a sort of pamphlet publication. It was a series of essays and texts written by some different cultural theorists. One of them was Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall is an extraordinary thinker. I think one of the most significant Black cultural theorists of the 20th century, 21st century. He's dead now, sadly. But I came across an essay by him, and he was talking about Black identity. And it was the first piece that I'd read. He talked about Black identity as a multiple, not a single thing. when I was growing up at the time, 1970s, 1980s, you turn on the TV and black people were always described as this kind of composite, so kind of monstrous, singular kind of thing, often target of racism, but the news was always about the black community as just this kind of singular object. The black community thinks that, the black community thinks on and on and on, as if we were only one thing, as if we could only be defined by gays. So Stuart Hall writes, he wrote about black identities. He wrote about the ways that black people could build and own and imagine their own lives and their own versions of what it meant to be black and what it meant to be alive. And it kind of blew my mind because it took me back to, again, the kind of dual experience of being a child of immigrants. But also it reminded me, it made sense to me of people like Prince. Prince, great fan of Prince, or even of hip hop. And I could see through the work that he was doing about how you can read and listen to this stuff as a zone of possibility, as a zone of self-fashioning, about how these artists were breaking out of convention in really exciting ways, were writing rules according to their own desires and their own curiosities rather than an external gaze. It's the first time that someone had described to me the world as I was already living through it and really experiencing it. Changed my life to the extent that I stole this pamphlet from the library. I kept it with me for many years because, like I said, it opened me up. So, origin story, if you want. This was the thing where I became aware of my own powers, where I realized that it's possible to think yourself into being, not to leave behind or escape from who you are, but to understand the complexity of who you are and the cultural heritages we have as a route towards yet further inquiry and exploration, further articulation of possibilities of being. Set me off on the path that I'm still on today.
So I think to round off the session, we have one last question from one of our colleagues who says, what message did you hope to portray with this exhibition, or what do you want people to take away from it?
Oh, well, I mean, it's in the title. We all live in the Black Fantastic. This is the thing, I think whether we realize it or not, we live in this racialized world that's based on a fantasy. But I think whether you're black or whether you're not black, I think that understanding our world as mutable, understanding our world not as fixed, but as a place within which we can continue to have conversations and propositions about who we are, about how we live. A number of the artists in the exhibition, for instance, are as articulate around ideas of gender and sexuality as they are around ideas of race. I think let's go beyond binaries. Let's go beyond fixed positions. Let's go beyond to a constant state of imagining and thinking aloud. Stuart Hall talks about cultural identity as an unfinished conversation. That seems to be a great phrase, a great reminder that who we are, who we can be, is an always ongoing, unfinished conversation. The Black Fantastic is simply another way of seeing, another way of being aware that we continue to make ourselves anew every day. At least we can do that. And sometimes fantastic things follow precisely from that.
That was great. I love that.
I feel like that question is a great segue into this question I wanted to ask. So one of the pieces that I seen that really hit me was actually Larry Ajampong's multidisciplinary relic traveler. It's kind of like the fact that we're finally making headway to be at the top, because as a continent, we have all these resources, we have the people. I honestly feel like we are magical. The future is, sky's the limit pretty much. But based off of your ideology, the Black Fantastic, what do you think are the necessary steps needed to be taken for the Black Fantastic to serve as a blueprint for cultural growth?
Ooh, I mean, it's a big one. I mean, it's an if, whether it does that or not. But I think, look, I guess I would come back to what we say. That there's a influential African economist called Felwine Sarr, who wrote a book a few years ago called Afrotopia. And in that book, Felwine Sarr talks about how, if you want to talk about a kind of future proposition for Africa, he proposes that we don't think so much in strictly economic terms about GDP and about income growth and so on. He proposes that the riches of the future of Africa lie in the cultural riches of Africa's past and Africa's present, that learning to or continuing to draw on cultural histories, rich cultural heritages, gives us a way of seeing ourselves, both on the African continent, but also in the diaspora, as people of beauty, grace, depth, richness, sophistication, cosmopolitanism, all of these things, which we know to be true anyway. If there's a future, the future lies simply in our continued assertion of ourselves as alive, as fully human, even when others are insisting that that's not the case. Touching that further for a moment, the term Black Lives Matter in some places is regarded as a controversial term, a contentious proposition. The word simply suggests that being alive and being Black is a matter of consideration, is a matter of fact, hardly contentious. The roots to our future, I think, lie in a continued underscoring of our aliveness, our humanness, and the possibilities for hope, for imagining, for beauty, for art that can follow from that. It's one of the things I believe anyway. So I remain pessimistic sometimes, but also deeply optimistic, because the most sustaining thing for me in general life is the extraordinary nature of Black cultural production and art. This is a thing I find deeply, deeply inspiring. This is what this place, my office here is full of evocations exactly of that. And as a writer, as a curator, it's one of the things that I want to share with the world, which is one of the reasons why I made this exhibition.
Thanks to my colleague Mel Larsen for co-hosting this episode with me, and thank you to Ekow Eshun for joining us on the WGSN Create Tomorrow podcast. His exhibition in the Black Fantastic is on at London's Hayward Gallery until 18th of September. The book is published by Thames and Hudson and out now. Thanks to my colleague Mel Larsen for co-hosting this episode with me. If you're a WGSN subscriber, look out for the report featuring this podcast, including images from the show. If you want to find out how to subscribe, head over to WGSN.com to discover how you can get access to our service. We're constantly publishing new content focusing on how we can design a brighter, better future for our industries, including food and drink, interiors, beauty, fashion, and consumer tech. You can subscribe to the show on all major podcast platforms, and if you like what you've heard, why not leave us a rating and review us on iTunes? I'd also like to thank our podcast producers, Bethan Ryder and Roland Bodenham. We'll be back in 2 weeks for our next episode, in which we'll be discussing the shifts in drinking culture with experts from WGSN Insight and Food and Drink. Until then, be fantastic.
Working in the e-commerce industry is a challenging, exciting, and ever-evolving career path. And if you find yourself working at a brand, manufacturer, retailer, or agency at any level, you know that the learning curve here can be steep, and it never truly flattens out. Essential Digital Commerce is excited to bring you Mastering Retail, a podcast masterclass on how to win in e-commerce across the largest platforms out there. You'll join me, Emma Irwin, a junior e-commerce associate, on a unique journey to mastering e-commerce through the perspective of both retail and media topics, paid search, content, supply chain, sales, data, and so much more, which is where the word retail comes from. At Essential Digital Commerce, our businesses offer a combination of analytics, strategy, and execution needed to win in the digital world. And I'll be talking to some of the brightest minds we have within our company, while making sure to keep it real and human, and even a little bit funny too.
they get rid of all the items in my basket.
I hate that.
I hate that so much.
Come on.
Like, you can have all my privacy and all my personal information. Just keep my stuff in the cart, right? Keep my basket, man.
If this hasn't already drawn you in, I'll give you some teasers of what we'll hear in this series. We'll hear from Patrick Miller, co-president of Essential Digital Commerce.
This sort of category creation, if you will, around the idea of media plus retail, creating this sort of, retail environment. And so just dove right in and started figuring it out.
We'll hear from Alex McCord, CEO of Enterprise Execution at Essential Digital Commerce.
Retail is the intersection of media and retail, given the cheeky name. But really, the more philosophical, it's just the acknowledgement that the two are completely interdependent. When you're thinking about digital commerce, you can't be successful at running media on retail media platforms if you don't understand how the retail elements work. And your retail elements will never be as successful as they possibly can without driving effective media.
Along with our guests representing Flywheel Digital, Edge by Essential, Perpetua, White Spider, OneSpace, and so many more. So you'll have to listen in. This podcast was built to educate everyone who works in e-commerce or may want to work in e-commerce. And while this masterclass may sound beginner level, trust me, the guests here are way too smart to only suit that audience, so there's something to be learned for anyone out there. With that, we hope to see you follow along so that you get the chance to listen to all of our amazing guests and the absolutely great questions that I asked.
It's a great question. It's a fantastic question. I love this question.
Great question.
Such a good question. Such a good question.
Ooh, that's a great question.
Such a good question.
Great question.
Good question.
So join us for the challenging, exciting, and ever-evolving ride to mastering retail.